Albuquerque, New Mexico. In the criminal underworld, one name made dealers nervous and distributors fall silent. Tuco Salamanca. The nephew of Hector Salamanca, a high-ranking member of the Juarez cartel, Tuco controlled the distribution network across the entire Southwest territory with an iron fist and a hair-trigger temper that could explode without warning. His reputation wasn't built on empty threats. 6 months earlier, a mid-level dealer named Dog Paulson tried to skim profits from a shipment. Tuco found out within 48 hours. He beat Dog with a baseball bat in front of 12 witnesses, sending a message that echoed through every corner and back alley in the city. Nobody skimmed from Tuco. Nobody questioned Tuco. Nobody survived disrespecting Tuco Salamanca. The man operated from an auto junkyard on the outskirts of town, a fortress of rusted metal and broken dreams. His crew consisted of hardened criminals who feared their boss more than they feared prison. Gonzo and No Doze, his top enforcers, had watched Tuco's explosive violence firsthand. They knew that working for him meant walking a razor's edge between profit and death. Tuco's product moved fast because dealers had no choice. Buy from Tuco or find yourself buried in the desert. The meth he distributed was decent quality, nothing special, but his monopoly on the territory meant competition simply didn't exist. Anyone who tried to set up shop independently either joined his network or disappeared permanently. When small-time amateur cooks appeared on his radar, Tuco saw them as insects to be crushed. Chemistry teachers playing gangster, suburban wannabes with no understanding of the streets. He'd dealt with dozens of them over the years, always the same way. Take their product, take their money, send them running back to their safe little lives. This time would be different. This time, the quiet chemistry teacher would teach Tuco Salamanca a lesson in respect he'd never forget. Jesse Pinkman thought he understood the game. He'd been dealing for years, moving product through high school kids and low-level users across Albuquerque. When he and his former chemistry teacher, Walter White, cooked their first batch of crystal meth, the purity numbers came back at 99%. The best meth anyone had ever seen in the Southwest. Jesse figured that kind of quality would speak for itself, that dealers would line up to do business. He was wrong. Jesse approached Tuco's junkyard alone, carrying a sample and hoping to negotiate a distribution deal. He'd heard the stories about Tuco's temper, but money talked louder than reputation in this business. At least, that's what Jesse believed when he walked through those junkyard gates. Tuco sat in his office, a cramped room filled with stolen car parts and the stale smell of cigarette smoke. No Doze and Gonzo flanked him like guard dogs, watching Jesse with dead eyes. When Jesse pulled out the meth sample, Tuco's demeanor shifted immediately. He tested it, tasted it, and his eyes went wide with recognition. This wasn't ordinary street garbage. This was pharmaceutical-grade product. "Where'd you get this?" Tuco demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. "I cooked it," Jesse said, trying to sound confident. "Me and my partner. We can supply you with a pound a week, maybe more. Best quality you've ever seen." Tuco laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. He looked at Jesse, the skinny kid in baggy clothes trying to play dealer, and saw nothing but weakness, an amateur, a punk who stumbled onto good product but had no idea how to protect it. "You cooked this?" Tuco repeated mockingly. "You?" He stood up, walking around the desk with predatory slowness. "You come into my territory, into my junkyard, and think you can negotiate with me like we're equals?" Before Jesse could respond, Tuco's fist connected with his face. Jesse stumbled backward, tasting blood, and suddenly understood his terrible miscalculation. This wasn't a negotiation, this was a robbery. Tuco took the meth sample and the entire pound Jesse had brought to demonstrate their capability. Then he grabbed a bag filled with cash, his own money, and proceeded to beat Jesse with it. Each strike was methodical, brutal, designed to send a message. The message was simple. Tuco didn't negotiate with amateurs. He took what he wanted. "You want to cook in my territory?" Tuco screamed between blows. "You pay me, you work for me, You don't walk in here like you're some kind of businessman." Gonzo and No-Doz watched without expression. They'd seen this show before. Tuco's violence was as predictable as sunrise, triggered by the slightest perceived disrespect. When Jesse finally escaped, bruised and bleeding, he'd lost everything. The meth, the money he'd invested in supplies, and most importantly, his pride. He crawled back to Walter White with the devastating news. Tuco Salamanca had stolen their product and nearly killed him in the process. Walter listened quietly, his face unreadable behind his glasses. The chemistry teacher, who'd never thrown a punch in his life, now faced a choice. Walk away from this business and accept the loss, or confront a psychopath who beat people for entertainment. Most people would have chosen safety, would have cut their losses and disappeared. But Walter White wasn't most people anymore. Cancer had given him a death sentence. Tuco Salamanca had just made a critical error. He'd assumed the quiet chemistry teacher would be too scared to fight back. Tuco would learn otherwise. Walter White stood in his bathroom at 3 a.m, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him belonged to a dying man, a 50-year-old chemistry teacher who'd spent 2 decades grading papers and explaining molecular structures to bored teenagers. That man had accepted every indignity life threw at him with quiet resignation. That man would have walked away from Tuco Salamanca's theft and considered himself lucky to escape alive. But that man was dying anyway. Cancer had already written his death sentence. The question wasn't whether Walter White would die, but what he would become before death arrived. He picked up the electric clippers and began shaving his head. Each pass of the blade removed another piece of the old Walter, the compliant Walter, the weak Walter. When he finished, a different man stared back from the mirror, harder, colder, unrecognizable. The next morning, Walter taught his regular chemistry class at J.P. Wynne High School. His students noticed the shaved head immediately, whispering and staring, but Walter ignored their reactions. He had a lesson to deliver, one that served a purpose beyond their education. "Today we're discussing fulminated mercury," Walter announced, writing the chemical formula on the board. Mercury fulminate is a primary explosive. It's extraordinarily sensitive to friction, heat, and shock. Even a small crystal, when struck or dropped, can detonate with tremendous force. He demonstrated with a tiny sample, using a hammer to strike it from a safe distance. The explosion was sharp and loud, making several students jump in their seats. Walter smiled slightly, watching their startled faces. The demonstration had worked perfectly. "The key characteristic of fulminated mercury," he continued, "is its instability. You can't predict exactly how it will react, which makes it incredibly dangerous. But in the right hands, with the right knowledge, that danger becomes a tool." After school, Walter returned to his garage and began synthesizing fulminated mercury. The process required precision and patience, 2 qualities he possessed in abundance. Chemistry had always made sense to him in ways that human behavior never did. Molecules followed predictable rules, mixed the right compounds in the right proportions under the right conditions, and the result was inevitable. But Walter had spent the past 48 hours studying a different kind of chemistry, the psychology of Tuco Salamanca. Jesse had described the beating in detail, sudden, explosive, disproportionate to any perceived offense. Tuco's violence wasn't strategic, it was emotional. He respected strength and despised weakness. He responded to fear, not reason. Most people would see those characteristics as obstacles. Walter saw them as variables in an equation he could solve. The plan crystallized in his mind with chemical clarity. Tuco expected victims to cower, to beg, to accept their losses and run. He expected the quiet chemistry teacher to behave like every other amateur he'd robbed and beaten. That expectation was Tuco's weakness, the unstable element in his personality that Walter could exploit. Violence alone wouldn't work. Walter couldn't outfight Tuco or his enforcers, but he could outthink them. He could demonstrate capability so shocking, so unexpected, that it would override Tuco's instinct for violence with something more powerful: fear. Walter carefully measured out several ounces of fulminated mercury and divided it into individual crystals. Each piece was a controlled explosion waiting to happen. He placed them in a leather bag, handling them with extreme care. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and the entire batch would detonate in his hands. But Walter White didn't make mistakes in chemistry. This was his domain, his expertise, his power. Tuco Salamanca controlled the streets through violence and intimidation. Walter White controlled molecules through knowledge and precision. Tomorrow he would walk into Tuco's junkyard office. Not as the beaten chemistry teacher Tuco expected, but as someone new, someone dangerous, someone who understood that in this world respect wasn't given, it was taken, and Walter White was about to take his. Walter White walked into Tuco Salamanca's junkyard the next afternoon, carrying a leather bag and wearing confidence he'd never possessed before. The shaved head, the black pork pie hat, the steady walk. Everything about him projected a different energy than the beaten chemistry teacher Tuco expected to cower and disappear. Gonzo and No Doze stood at the entrance, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons when they saw him approach. Walter didn't flinch. He simply stated his business with calm authority. "I'm here to see Tuco. Tell him Walter White wants to discuss a business proposition." The enforcers exchanged confused glances. This bald man walking into their territory like he owned it didn't match any profile they recognized, but something in his demeanor, the absolute lack of fear, made them hesitate. They escorted him inside, rather than throwing him out. Tuco sat in his cluttered office, counting money with manic energy. When Walter entered, Tuco's face shifted from confusion to amusement. He remembered this man from Jesse's description, the chemistry teacher, the cook, the amateur who thought he could play in the big leagues. "You got some nerve coming here," Tuco said, his voice carrying that unpredictable edge between humor and violence. "Your boy Jesse barely walked out of here last week. You want the same treatment?" Walter set the leather bag on Tuco's desk with deliberate care. "I'm here about the product you stole. 1 pound of methamphetamine, 99% pure. Street value approximately $60,000, plus compensation for my partner's medical expenses from the beating you administered." Tuco laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal walls. "Compensation? Medical expenses? You think this is some kind of insurance company? This is my territory. I take what I want." "You took my product," Walter continued, his voice never rising, never wavering. "I'm here to collect payment, $50,000, and I brought you more product to demonstrate good faith for future business." Tuco's amusement faded slightly, replaced by curiosity about this strange, fearless man standing in his office. He opened the leather bag and pulled out one of the crystals, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who'd handled countless drug samples. "This better be as good as the last batch," Tuco muttered, preparing to test it. "It's better," Walter said. "But I wouldn't taste it if I were you. That's not methamphetamine." Tuco froze, his eyes snapping up to meet Walter's. "What?" "That's fulminated mercury," Walter explained with the calm precision of a chemistry teacher delivering a lecture. "A primary explosive, extraordinarily unstable, sensitive to friction, heat, and shock." Before Tuco could react, before Gonzo and No Doze could draw their weapons, Walter picked up a single crystal and hurled it against the floor. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. The office erupted in a flash of light and concussive force that shattered every window, knocked furniture across the room, and sent Tuco's enforcers sprawling. The walls shook, metal panels rattled. The air filled with smoke and the acrid smell of chemical combustion. Walter stood in the center of the destruction, completely calm, holding the leather bag above his head. Tuco staggered to his feet, his ears ringing, his face blackened with soot, staring at this chemistry teacher who'd just turned his office into a war zone. "That was 1 ounce, Walter said, his voice cutting through the ringing silence. "This bag contains 7 more ounces. I'll throw the entire thing if you don't give me what I came for. For the first time in his violent life, Tuco Salamanca felt genuine fear. This wasn't a man he could beat into submission. This wasn't someone who played by street rules. This was someone far more dangerous, someone who understood that knowledge was the ultimate weapon. Tuco raised his hand slowly, a gesture of surrender that shocked even his own crew. Okay, man, you win. Just put the bag down. Walter didn't move. $50,000. And from now on, you buy exclusively from me. Those are my terms. Tuco nodded frantically, gesturing to Gonzo. Pay him now. Gonzo stumbled to the safe in the corner of the destroyed office, his hands shaking as he worked the combination. His ears still rang from the explosion, and smoke continued to drift through the shattered windows. No-Do sat against the wall, dazed and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, staring at Walter White with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Tuco remained frozen in place, his eyes locked on the leather bag Walter still held above his head. The drug lord who'd built his reputation on unpredictable violence now found himself completely outmatched by a chemistry teacher holding 7 ounces of explosive crystals. Every instinct that had kept Tuco alive in the criminal underworld screamed the same message. This man was more dangerous than anyone he'd ever encountered. 50,000, Walter repeated, his voice carrying absolute authority. And from this moment forward, you distribute exclusively for me. £2 per week minimum, you pay up front, no exceptions. Tuco nodded frantically, gesturing for Gonzo to hurry with the money. Yeah, man, whatever you want, just put that thing down, please. Walter didn't move. He stood perfectly still, watching as Gonzo counted out stacks of cash with trembling fingers. The mathematics of fear played out exactly as Walter had calculated. Tuco understood violence, respected violence, but this wasn't violence. This was controlled annihilation. One wrong move, one moment of the old Tuco temper flaring up, and everyone in this office would die in a chemical explosion. 50,000, Gonzo announced, placing the money in a duffel bag and sliding it across the floor toward Walter. Walter lowered the leather bag slowly, carefully, and set it on the desk. He picked up the duffel bag with his other hand, checking the contents with the meticulous attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime grading papers and measuring chemicals. Satisfied, he zipped it closed. One more thing, Walter said, his eyes meeting Tuco's. If you or your people ever touch my partner again, if you ever steal from me, if you ever think about cutting me out or replacing me with another cook, I'll make more of this. He gestured to the leather bag. And next time, I won't give you a warning. I'll walk in here and throw the entire batch without saying a word. Tuco raised his hands higher, a gesture of complete submission. We're cool, man. We're partners now. I respect what you did here. Seriously, you got my word. Nobody touches you or your boy. Your word means nothing to me, Walter said flatly. What means something is that you understand I can destroy you anytime I choose. Chemistry isn't just about making product. It's about understanding how molecules interact, how compounds react, how explosions happen. I know a dozen different ways to turn this office into a crater. This was the gentlest option. The threat hung in the air, like the smoke still drifting through the broken windows. Tuco Salamanca, the man who'd beaten people to death for minor disrespect, who'd built an empire on fear and violence, nodded like a scolded child. I understand, Tuco said quietly. You're the man. Heisenberg's the man. Walter paused at the name. Heisenberg. Jesse had mentioned it before, a street name, an alter ego, a persona separate from the dying chemistry teacher. In this moment, standing in the wreckage of Tuco's office with $50,000 and a bag of explosives, Walter White understood that Jesse was right. The man who'd walked into this junkyard wasn't the same man who'd spent 22 years teaching teenagers about periodic tables. That man was dead. Heisenberg had replaced him. Walter picked up his leather bag with extreme care and walked toward the door. Gonzo and No-Dos pressed themselves against the walls, giving him a wide path. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved until Walter had disappeared through the junkyard gates. Only then did Tuco exhale, his shoulders sagging with relief. He looked at his destroyed office, at the shattered windows and scorched walls, at the evidence of what one chemistry teacher could do with knowledge and desperation. "Clean this up," Tuco ordered his crew, his voice lacking its usual manic energy. "And get me that crystal, all of it. Whatever that bald guy wants to cook, we're buying." Walter White drove away from Tuco's junkyard with $50,000 in cash and something far more valuable, respect earned through calculated violence. He parked 3 blocks away, hands trembling on the steering wheel as the adrenaline finally caught up with his nervous system. For 10 minutes, he sat in silence, processing what he'd just done. He'd walked into a drug lord's territory, threatened a psychopath with explosives, and emerged victorious without firing a shot or throwing a punch. Chemistry had been his weapon, knowledge had been his armor, and fear, pure, overwhelming fear, had been his victory. The phone rang, Jesse's number. "Mr. White, you okay? You've been gone for hours. I thought maybe I got the money," Walter interrupted. "All 50,000, and Tuco agreed to distribute for us exclusively. £2 per week, paid up front." Silence on the other end. Then Jesse's voice, barely above a whisper. What did you do?" "I demonstrated our value proposition," Walter said simply. "Tuco understands now that we're not amateurs he can rob and dismiss. We're partners, equals." When Walter returned to Jesse's house, the younger man stared at him with a mixture of awe and concern. The shaved head, the calm demeanor, the bag of cash. Everything about Mr. White had changed. This wasn't the nervous chemistry teacher who'd insisted they could make money without hurting anyone. "You blew up his office, didn't you?" Jesse said, piecing together the rumors already spreading through the street network. "People are saying some bald guy walked into Tuco's place and destroyed everything. That's you." Walter nodded. "Fulminated mercury. 1 ounce created an explosion powerful enough to shatter every window and knock his enforcers unconscious. I threatened to use 7 more ounces if he didn't pay. He paid." Jesse laughed, a sound caught between relief and disbelief. "Man, I thought you were going to get us both killed, but you actually did it. You made Tuco Salamanca back down. Nobody makes Tuco back down." Over the following weeks, the relationship between Walter and Tuco evolved into genuine business partnership. Every Tuesday, Gonzo would arrive at a predetermined location with cash payment for 2 pounds of methamphetamine. Every Thursday, Jesse would deliver the product. No threats, no violence, no theft. Just clean, professional transactions that would have been impossible before the fulminated mercury explosion. Word spread through Albuquerque's criminal network about the mysterious cook who destroyed Tuco's office and lived to tell about it. Dealers whispered the name Heisenberg with a mixture of fear and respect. The chemistry teacher had become a legend without most people even knowing his real identity. But the transformation cost Walter more than he initially understood. Standing in his high school classroom a month after the Tuco confrontation, teaching periodic tables to disinterested teenagers, Walter felt the disconnect growing. These students saw Mr. White, the mild-mannered teacher who graded papers and explained molecular structures. They had no idea that same man had threatened a cartel-connected psychopath with chemical explosives and won. The duality became harder to maintain. Walter White. The teacher felt like a costume he wore during daylight hours. Heisenberg, the drug manufacturer, felt increasingly like his true self. The man who'd discovered power came from knowledge, respect came from fear, and survival required becoming someone capable of terrible things. At home, Skylar noticed the changes, but couldn't identify their source. Her husband seemed more confident, more assertive, more present than he'd been in years. She attributed it to the cancer treatments working, to Walter fighting his diagnosis with renewed determination. She had no idea he was fighting something else entirely, fighting to maintain his humanity while discovering that power felt better than mortality ever had. The Tuco arrangement proved enormously profitable. Within 2 months, Walter had earned more money than his teaching salary provided in 3 years. The nest egg for his family grew exponentially. His original goal, providing financial security before cancer claimed him, had been achieved multiple times over. But Walter didn't stop cooking, couldn't stop, because the quiet chemistry teacher who'd started this journey to help his family had discovered something far more intoxicating than money. He was good at this, really good. And being good at something dangerous made him feel more alive than 22 years of safe, predictable teaching ever had. The story of Walter White's confrontation with Tuco Salamanca became legend in Albuquerque's criminal underworld. Dealers who'd never met him knew the name Heisenberg. Distributors who'd worked with countless cooks understood this one was different. The quiet chemistry teacher who'd walked into a psychopath's office with a bag of explosives had fundamentally changed the power dynamics of the entire Southwest drug trade. Tuco Salamanca, the violent enforcer who'd built his reputation on unpredictable brutality, never recovered his dominance after that day. The man who'd beaten rivals to death with his bare hands had been reduced to submission by knowledge and chemistry. Word spread quickly. Violence had limits, but science had none. A man who understood molecules could destroy anyone, anywhere, anytime. For Walter White, the Tuco confrontation represented the point of no return in his transformation. He'd entered that junkyard as a dying teacher, desperate for money. He'd left as Heisenberg, a criminal who understood that respect in this world came from demonstrating capability without mercy. The cancer patient who'd started cooking meth to leave money for his family had discovered something far more intoxicating than financial security: power. The lesson Walter learned that day would define every decision that followed. Chemistry wasn't just a subject he taught to bored teenagers. It was the ultimate weapon, more powerful than guns, more devastating than violence, more terrifying than any threat. 1 ounce of fulminated mercury had accomplished what years of Tuco's beatings never could. It had created genuine fear in a fearless man. Jesse watched his former teacher's transformation with growing concern. Mr. White had stopped being Mr. White. The man who'd insisted they could make money without hurting anyone had become someone who solved problems with calculated explosions. The moral boundaries that had seemed so important in the beginning dissolved like the fulminated mercury crystals dissolving in their beakers. Years later, when federal agents finally pieced together Heisenberg's criminal empire, they would trace everything back to this moment. The teacher who'd threatened a cartel distributor with chemical explosives had set in motion a chain of events that would destroy families, end lives, and prove that knowledge without conscience created the most dangerous criminals of all. Tuco Salamanca had mocked Walter White as a weak chemistry teacher playing gangster. That mistake cost him his reputation, his dominance, and eventually his life. The quiet man with the explosives had taught him the most important lesson in the drug trade: never underestimate someone who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. 1 ounce of fulminated mercury destroyed an office, but it destroyed something far more important. It destroyed the last remnants of Walter White's humanity, leaving only Heisenberg behind.